Okay, Mr. Phobes here again. This is mini lesson number 2 on the chromatic transparency project. And again, just to review, we're going to do two equal or relatively equal compositions. One is going to be with a split complement color scheme, and then the other is going to be an analogous scheme. Okay, so we're going to use an isotype and then two shapes of choice. And an isotype is an objective shape that conveys a product, animal, person, or process. So we'll go to the website here of Gerd Arntz, and he's the guy that developed isotypes in the 40s and 50s. He was a graphic designer, and his intention was to create universal symbols that people would recognize worldwide. There's many more isotypes than these. You don't have to use them, but this just shows that they're very simple, usually vector graphics. We want to stick to ones that are simple shapes. For example, something like this would be too complex. Really, we've got one shape, two shape, three shape, four shape. So that wouldn't really work. This would be okay, something like this with a little bit of open space in it. The airplane would work. The skull would work. Those kinds of things would work. This would work. Again, maybe the baby by itself, but not the circle. You can use shapes like these that are actually, they're going to look like they have a negative space punched in them. That would work. This would be too complex. I think you kind of get the idea. This is too complex. Very simple shapes, but again, that they represent an animal, person, process, or product. So in this one, I really have basically two isotypes, and that's okay. One is the pig, and then one is the syringe. I picked the circle, or actually constructed the circle as one of my shapes of choice. So the idea is that you're going to create some sort of meaning, and so this is basically a graphic design problem. So the isotype is the one objective shape that sort of ensures that you've got something to grab onto. You could use three isotypes if you wanted to. So again, you want to use three simple shapes. They could be one isotype and two you know, objective shapes. They could be three isotypes, whatever you want. But what we really need is that they need to be relatively broad, large shapes, and they need large areas of overlap. Because just like when we did the achromatic transparency project, it's all about overlap and showing the different transparencies. So this one, we've used a split complement color scheme of violet, yellow, and green. And if we look at, so yellow is the color, and then violet and green are the splits from that. We can see that when they start to mix, the yellow and the green is going to make yellow green. The violet and the yellow is going to make this sort of desaturated kind of orangey. The violet and the green is going to make a desaturated green, and all three mixed together make this relatively neutral gray. So I've taken this palette, show how they overlap, and then created the different overlap colors here. I've done this in Illustrator, and that's the way we're going to do it. The ground can be any of the hue or mixtures that occur within the chosen split complement. So the ground, if you look at this, is actually a tint of this mixture of the violet plus green. So I just added some white to it. And it's a relatively neutral ground, and that tends to work really well for this because we want the three main colors to come forward, and we want the ground to recede. One of the best things to do is to kind of look at it in grayscale. So we want one value to be very dark. We want one shape to have a value that's about 50%, and one shape to have a value that's about 90%, and then the ground is going to be a different value than those. So we'll go through as we're working, and we'll convert them to grayscale, and we'll make sure that we're on target for the values. Okay, so again, we're going to use split complement for one and a analogous for another. Now, the split complements, you could get away with using the hues at their prismatic. But when we start working with the analogous hues, they're going to be so close together in hue that we absolutely have to spread their value out by creating tints, tones, and shades. So here I've got blue green, green, and yellow green. So here's the blue green, um, the pig is green, and then the yellow green is the circle. So what I've done is I've added black to the green, so I've got a shade of green, and then I've added white to the blue green to create a tint. And then the yellow green, I've actually added a little bit of white to it too. But you can also see that now I've got these a much broader range of value than if I had left them at their prismatic. So here's the rules. You can do this either in traditional media, basically acrylic paint on Bristol board, or you can do it in digital media. We're going to use 8 by 10 Bristol. So you could do two different designs that are 8 by 10, or you could do one design that's 10 by 16 and has one common shape. We'll look at examples of that. If you do it in digital media, you can use either one or two, but you must post three completely different solutions online and print and mount the one solution and paint color swatches in acrylic to match the hues in the project. So we'll look at that. If you decide to paint it, you're just going to mount it on the board, but you don't have to paint the color swatches, and we'll look at examples of that. Okay, so here is an example of the project. This demo I did an 8 by 8, so that's wrong. Don't get confused by that. But basically, when you do it digitally, then you will generate these painted swatches of all the hues that are in here, right? So you can see that there's the red orange, there's the blue, there's the yellow, there's the blue plus yellow, and then there's my ground, which is the green plus orange tint, and then it's the same with this. So this is a digital model. We'll look at some painted models here in a minute. We're going to mount it on a 15 by 20 board, and you're going to mount them side by side. Okay. This is important that when you're working in digital media, all hues need to be at 100% opacity. I've seen students do this where they don't figure out how to do that, so all they do is they make these, they reduce the opacity of the shapes, to like maybe 70%, and they overlap them. That won't work. That's not what we're doing. It creates a much more washed out look that way, and I can tell immediately if you've done that. So I won't give you any credit if you do if that's the way you do it. You have to follow the instructions on how to do this correctly. So here's some examples. Here's one that was done by Annika Stone last fall, and you can see that she used this shape of a skull, a bottle, and then a fish, and it's basically the exact same design. They're just side by side. Here you can see this is her color scheme. So she used yellow, which is this. So she's got a slightly desaturated tone of yellow, which that's okay. And then she used the cyan blue, which is up here. It's a shade of cyan blue. And then she used a tint of violet. I think she's got a little bit too much magenta in it, but that's her split complement. She then went to the analogous. She used cyan, cyan blue, and blue. And you can see that she's got a nice dark shade of it. Looks like probably the cyan blue. She's got a very, very light tint of the cyan. It looks kind of white from the photograph. It wasn't really that light. And then she's got the cyan blue pretty much at its prismatic. And you can see how when they overlap, the way they mix. So this is a good example of one that's completely hand painted. Both sections are hand painted. Here's one that's digital. Now I don't have the swatches posted, but we'll look at one. This is one where you do a unified composition, which it would be, instead of having two 8 by 10s next to each other, you make one 16 by 10. One shape is common to the composition, right? So there's 5 shapes. So the camel here is common. Um, and his split complement is cyan green, so you can see this is a tint of cyan green, and then he used red and magenta. So here's the red, it's got a little bit of white in it, and then here's the magenta, it's also got a little bit of white in it. That's okay, but then when he goes to his analogous, um, he had to, his analogous are the again, the cyan green, uh, the cyan, and green. So he's got a tint of green, he's got a shade of cyan, and then he's used this tint of cyan green. And it works pretty well together conceptually. He's got, a symbol here, and then the pyramid. What's kind of clever, look at the way he did this, is that the way this shape overlaps, he very intentionally made it look like the pyramid becomes three-dimensional. That's really a good use of the way the overlap is. He structured it very carefully, and I thought that was a really clever way of creating this sort of three-dimensional quality to this. Here's one that was painted, and now it's two images that are side by side. It very cleverly shares one shape, but they don't share the same color. But what's kind of nice about this is she used yellow and yellow green, and they're close enough together they kind of read. Um, this is all hand painted, and you can see that this was her split complement was yellow green, um, blue, and then magenta, right? You can see the blue, the magenta, and the yellow green. She used these at their prismatic. It works okay doing it that way. But then when she did her analogous, which was yellow, orange, and red, she had to do a really deep shade of the orange and then a tint of the red. She might have a little bit too much magenta when she mixed her red here, but it's, you can see that it's a tint, and then the yellow is at its prismatic, and that still works quite well. Uh, Here's another one that is digital, and you can see it's a very simple composition. If you're going to use lines, it's okay, but fatten them up so we get a good amount of overlap. You can see, here's her split complement. She used the cyan blue, uh, red, and yellow. And again, those are almost at their prismatic, and that works. She's got probably a tint of yellow here, but it looks like the cyan blue and the red are at prismatics. Now, when she goes to her uh, analogous, she's definitely taken this cyan blue and added a little black to it. She's got cyan at its prismatic, and then this is probably the blue. I'm sorry, this is the blue. This would be the cyan, and this is the cyan blue with tint added to it. Pretty simple. Looks like she's got a probably desaturated cyan for her ground, and here probably a desaturated. It looks like it's actually a tint of this hue right here for her ground, and that works really well, these sort of desaturated hues for the ground. Here's one that is a photograph of the project. So these two are digital, and then there's the painted swatches. You can tell that they're painted. So they were printed and mounted, and then the swatches were painted. This obviously she needed to paint it a little bit heavier, more coats on it. Um, and then here's the last one. This is just another way to do it, where you could arrange the swatches this way. There's many ways of presenting this, but the bottom line is, if you're going to do it digitally, you need to print out the digital image. You'll go to Cal Copy and do that, and then you're going to have to paint swatches by hand to match the various hues that are in your design. So that's all there is to it.